Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our podcast series of Pakistan at 100. Today, I'm joined by Luke Sonnet. Hi, Luke.
Hi.
Luke is a PhD candidate at UCLA. He's a graduate student affiliate at California Center for Population Research at UCLA. His research basically focuses on electoral accountability, the relation between governance and development, and the role that machine learning can play in social sciences. He's also worked on developing packages software such as Estimate R, which is an R package of estimators used by social sciences. Today we're going to talk about election administration and the role that technology can play in helping aid the electoral process, and how, with the recent breakdown of the RTS system in Pakistan elections, how the pitfalls and the promises of technology in elections are proceeded for the future. So Luke, let's set the pretext for this discussion and talk about the actual process of election in Pakistan.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Election administration is not a very glamorous topic, but it's super important for understanding the ways in which different actors can influence the way elections work, either legitimately or illegitimately. And that happens primarily through the many different steps in the elections process, from the process when candidates have to get their nominations approved, where they go through various scrutiny checks with the State Bank of Pakistan or the National Accountability Board, and then through that process. But then I think what we'll be talking more about today probably is what happens on the day of the elections. And I obviously didn't vote in this election, but from seeing online all the different steps and talking to people, all the different steps that people have to go through on the polling day, where they, having to make sure that the fingerprints are on the forms, on the ballot papers, making sure that they're signed appropriately, that they're folded appropriately. In the right way. All these kinds of steps. And so there's all of those things that can go wrong. But then in terms of the actual election administration, just to kind of preview the steps that we'll be talking about a little bit later. At each polling station, right, there's the presiding officer who's in charge of filling out the Form 45s, all of the different results at the polling station. And then they're supposed to send these forms to the returning officer who aggregates all of these results. And they were also supposed to, as you mentioned, the RTS system, take a picture of these results and send them directly to a central location. That system broke down. Then the returning officer collects all these Form 45s, creates the Form 46, and tallies them all together. And then they produce the official documentation that goes to the ECP, and that gets posted online. And then the ECP turns around and notifies candidates, notifies the public. And so in all these steps, there are things that the ECP has tried to do, such as the fingerprints on the papers to ensure that each ballot is legitimate. To trying to get this electronic transmission up and running so that the results are transparently made available very early. And then, just trying to make sure there's oversight of all the returning officers. But in all these processes, there's places for breakdown, and there's different solutions that have been tried around the world to try to get around these problems.
Okay, so in terms of generally defining rigging, because it's a very common phrase, so to speak, in our country, rigging basically is electoral fraud, manipulation, or basically any illegal interference in the process of any democratic election. And either by increasing the vote bank of your favorite candidate or reducing it of the unfavorable one. But either way, rigging is not only common during elections but also pre-election. But I think for now we should start with how rigging happens during elections, on the day of election,
Well, what you see a lot of the time, what's really common is what's seen a lot in the press and made fun of in cartoons and stuff is stuff like ballot stuffing, where you'll often see an overflowing ballot box where people are just coming in and adding a whole bunch of ballots to the ballot pool. And it's not really clear how common this is anymore. Although in some elections in some parts of the world, you'll see turnout greater than 100% in some areas, right? And so then there's a lot of questions raised about that. But then I think, that's pretty common and straightforward. People just who gain access to the ballot boxes add more papers. Now, they've tried to solve this problem with the Form 46s at the polling station level, where they're supposed to, the presiding officer is supposed to count the number of ballot papers total, and they're supposed to have some fixed number that they were delivered, right? And so then those should add up to try to limit that problem. But I think there's a lot more that happens around the world, maybe not necessarily here. Again, it's hard to measure in terms of aggregator fraud. And what happens here is when the presiding officer returns the Form 45s or the equivalent, wherever they are, to the kind of overseer, they get all of these Form 45s and then they have to put them together. And at that point, it's really easy for them to go ahead and just change some of the numbers, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it's a lot easier for somebody who wants to influence the elections to, instead of going to every polling station and trying to get everybody on board with doing something illegal, they only have to convince one person, right, who's kind of sitting at the top. And so there's a great example of this from Russia where you could observe it after the fact, because they released the polling station level, the precinct level, but some low level of results, the polling station level results. And when researchers looked at these, there were these spikes in the distribution of vote shares at 50, 55, 65, and 70 at even numbers along the spectrum of like from 50 to 80. And so what these returning officers were doing is they were just basically like picking a number and like 55%. Let's make sure that Putin's party gets 55% of the vote in my constituency. And then they like pick that number and then they put it down. So it's like clearly like some fraud being put in place there. And that's an interesting case because you might say, well, that's a really dumb way to do it because it's super obvious that you're doing it, right? But the other side of the coin is that sometimes aggregators put these kind of signals in to show that they committed fraud, to tell the people that they're supposed to be like benefiting, that look, I actually was able to do this for you, right? So if you're, say you're working for a party and you're like and you want to make, and you have these people at these polling station level who you want to have, make sure that you win a certain percent. How do you know whether or not they actually committed the fraud? It's like very hard for you to monitor, right, whether they followed through. But if they're like, what if I show you that I'll say I'll give you 65% of the vote, and then at the end of the day they get 65.
But doesn't that open them up to prosecution as well if they get caught? Because it's a very risky way to show that you.
I think that's true, and that's a very good point. So that mechanism where, I mean, aggregator fraud can happen anywhere, but the mechanism where you're like signaling with very clear numbers what you can do, that's more likely in a setting where, like Putin's Russia, where like there's not really fear of you being prosecuted by the opposition who like comes into power. It might be more problematic in places where who's in power in the future is more in question. But even if it's not those clear numbers, there are also kinds of forensic methods from accounting that people use, because humans aren't good at randomly picking numbers. If you ask a random sample of people to pick a number between 1 and 10, overwhelmingly 7 is one of the things that people answer. It's like it stands out all the time. And so when people are filling out numbers, faking numbers on a form, they might go ahead and just the numbers that they'll produce will follow certain distributions, and if they're and then you can study whether it's like a normal number distribution or whether it's following this skewed distribution.
So it's very obvious to point out.
It's not very obvious because you need good quality data, and you need a lot of polling station level results to be able to detect this. But it can be found.
Okay. And then moving to, I think these days now pre-election rigging is becoming quite the norm, and it's becoming very popular and very common.
Right.
So for instance, in I think 2002, Musharraf tried to introduce a law where anybody standing in elections and in government had to have had a bachelor's degree. So that's in a way limiting access of people who could participate. It was later amended in 2009 and removed, but there was a lot of controversy around the fact that he's actually limiting access of people who have good experience and have a good performance and a good history, but just because they don't have a degree, they can't do it. But there's a lot of countries, for instance Iran requires you to have a master's degree when you're entering the government. America doesn't, but usually out of the entire senators, there's only 19 people who don't have a degree in the American thing. So with this argument, how do you try to save pre-election rigging and try to lessen it? And like more importantly, what kinds do exist? Because to the public, vote fixing, ballot filling, these are more common. Pre-election day riggings are. Yeah,
so election day rigging is a lot like more of an obvious thing in terms of when it's found out, like, oh, these boxes were missing, or you'll hear in the news, like, or there'll be pictures on WhatsApp groups of, I found all of these ballots that went missing or whatever, right? and there's all these conspiracy theories, and so people are really invested in this. But it is most of the groundwork. When those in power want to influence elections, most of the groundwork happens before elections. And this has been happening more and more often these days. There's a great data set put out by two economists at Oxford, Bishop and Hoffler, where they look at the trends of different kinds of electoral malfeasance around the world. And they show that like the incidence of election day rigging is flat or even decreasing as a share of the overall elections, but this pre-election rigging is happening more and more. The example you bring up of like of education requirements is a really interesting one, because on some level that's an appealing policy to a lot of people. They're like, oh, we need to make sure that we have our best and brightest in office. I personally disagree with that for like other reasons, but it also, like you says, restricts access to whole groups of people. And in the case of Musharraf here, the fact that you introduce that bill when you know who has a degree or doesn't already in office, right? So he looks at all of the MPAs and M&As that are currently in office, and he goes, well, maybe there are some people that I don't want to continue to be in office. And so an easy way to do that, that's publicly justifiable, would be to go ahead and pass a bill that requires there to be a certain degree requirements. So that kind of stuff is pretty common. There's a lot of other stuff that can be done. Again, returning to Russia, I don't really want to rag on Russia too much, but returning to the Russian case, there's often stories of like selective enforcement of tax law, where certain people are only punished after the fact or after a while. Once they're no longer desirable, they can be like, oh, well, you didn't pay. There's a lot more scrutiny on people. And this links kind of to what happened here as well with the Sharifs. Now, I'm not like adjudicating their case, but the timing of when the conviction was handed out, so close to the election, you kind of have to wonder, like, would it have been better served to do that earlier, try to get it done in a more efficient way, or wait till later and wait till after the election? Now, that's a very difficult question, but you could say that the timing of these kinds of decisions, disqualifications, big announcements, can influence elections. And you see that in the United States, actually, with the letters around Hillary Clinton's, her email scandal around her private email server. And there was a release by then Director James Comey of the FBI a week before the election, where he told Congress, I have found new emails that are pertinent to the investigation. And so there was no other real content to that message, just like, we found more. And this happens a week before. It creates a huge media firestorm. Everybody latches onto this story. And then 2 days before the election, he says, there was nothing new in these emails.
But the damage has been done.
Yeah, the idea is that the damage had been done. She had a lead in the polling of about, I forget how many points, but the moral of the story is that like half of her lead in polling basically fell apart after that point. There may have been other things that influenced it, of course, but so like the timing of these kinds of announcements, and neither of those are particularly like incorrect investigations. The Sharifs were obviously implicated by the Panama Papers. It was a breach of protocol for Hillary Clinton to have a private email server. But when you talk about these things, how you talk about these things, and when you enforce the laws is an easy tool. And then there's all kinds of other things that can be done, like censoring media access, allowing certain people to have more time in the public eye. It could be when you give out permits for rallies and stuff like that, who you actually allow to go out. And then there can be more nefarious things that could be done, outright disqualifying candidates and stuff like that. That's just a lot more strict. Yeah.
Okay, then coming on to our main argument, which is what technology promises, but and its pitfalls, and how we can use it to prevent rigging.
Right.
So, and what we saw with the RTS results transmission system, and how it seemed to fail on the election day, like the night of the election day, and the results were delayed. There's also an entire argument that it didn't fail and it was made to fail.
Right, of course.
There's also that argument.
Right.
But if we set that aside for now, how do you ensure that technological improvements continue to do the advancement that they're meant to do, and help election days?
Right. Technologies are often viewed as a kind of cure-all for any problems that come up in society. People don't have enough access to money. Well, let's just put money on phones and have microfinance, and like that works. And so that's a great example. But then there's other cases where you people try to force technology onto domains and it doesn't really solve the problem. Elections are one where technology has certainly helped, but it's a mixed bag. So you have cases like the RTS system breaking down, but to be honest, I'm not sure that we should have been super surprised by that, in the sense that they didn't really have a lot of time to pilot it. All of these, this is a huge enterprise. There's something like 80,000+ polling stations in the country. They were basically they were gonna give like some subsidy of like 1,000 rupees to these presiding officers to use their own phones to send this. So they didn't have time to get everybody phones or the resources. And so there were a lot of places where it could have broken down. A case where the ECP really piloted a new technology, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is where they actually did try to roll out biometric verification machines in a by-election, and they realized it wasn't working, it wasn't up to snuff, and so they didn't implement it. And so then that's something where you're like, okay, we can try this technology out, and we realize it doesn't work. But I think the real promise of a system like the results transmission system is just to improve transparency, and it really addresses the one type of fraud that we discussed earlier, the aggregator fraud. Right. So you're taking discretion out of the hands of the returning officers by giving the central authority immediately the results from the presiding officers, from the officers at the polling station level. So they can automatically see the electronic results. There's like postal ballots and stuff that still have to come in, but it at least gives a good idea of what's going on.
And it eliminates a certain amount of fraud at least.
Right.
On the day of the election.
Yeah, it takes discretion out of somebody's hands. And what's interesting about this is that we actually have really high quality evidence that this works from Pakistan's neighbors in Afghanistan. There are a couple of researchers, Michael Callan and James Long. What they did was they randomly, during elections like 6 or so years ago, they randomly picked certain polling stations in the country, and they sent letters to the presiding officers telling them that they were going to take pictures of the equivalent of the Form 45s at the station, and then they were going to have those to check later. It wasn't an official election commission system, right? Okay. They were just telling them, we're going to do this as like external auditors. Okay. We're going to take pictures, and then we'll compare them later to the central results. And when they did this, what they found was that the votes that were won by the most connected candidate were reduced by 25%. And so that's a huge decrease in the amount of support that these powerful candidates have that is being caused solely by notifying these officers that they're going to be monitored.
Yeah, that they're being watched, basically.
Exactly, that they're being watched. Right. And so it's not clear whether this was cutting down on aggregator fraud or just making the presiding officers like behave better at the station, right? But either way, there's a huge decrease. And so that's a really promising example of a technological innovation. One thing with all tech innovations is that over time, interested parties react and adapt. And so even if you were able to constrain presiding officers and keep them from doing the kinds of fraud that can be prevented using this kind of system, eventually people might try another way around things. And so there's always different tools at people's disposal.
As technology progresses, people also progress. So there's it's a correlated thing.
Right.
And then you also mentioned biometric. How?
Oh, right. Yeah, the trial that the ECP did. Yeah.
Yeah. So they've been building up their database. Our CNIC cards now have a digitized fingerprint on them, and so it's not that our database is lacking, because it's been a couple of years now, and they've even linked it to BISP, and they're doing everything they can. But then there's also the issue of, I think you would talk more about this, about how fingerprints are not always clear for certain people, and how on election day, if you rely solely on using electronic means of identifying fingerprints, it's not the most authentic way to do so. Right. So then how do you deal with this?
Yeah, the problem the ECP faced in NA 120, where they did this pilot in a by-election in 2017, late 2017, I think it was. They reported that about 12% of fingerprints couldn't be read at the polling station. Exactly. So if you extrapolate this out to like the whole population of Pakistan, that's millions and millions of people that are being disenfranchised by this system. So they realized it wasn't ready to be rolled out. and you're right that the database is being built, but it is a whole effort where you have to basically renew all of the voter rolls. But they're already in the process of doing that now that it's explicitly linked with CNICs. And so that system, like the ability to use biometric verification machines on top of this new registry is totally possible. But even then, there are problems. So a case that I know personally is the Ghanaian case, where in Ghana they've had biometric machines in their elections for 3 elections in a row now, 3 general national elections. And the first time they did it, it was this huge event because they had to overhaul the whole registry. They had to build it from scratch. Tons of people went off the registry that had either passed away or that were there twice and stuff like that. There are all kinds of irregularities that they had to resolve. So that was like a good step in terms of cleaning up the government's kind of understanding of the voting population. But then on the election day, you still have to make sure everything runs smoothly. And so with a couple of co-authors, Miriam Golden, Eric Cremon, Georgia Fosu, Sarah Brierly, Joseph Asunka, everybody kind of working on this, a lot of us working on this project, they implemented an experiment where they were working with election observers to randomly place them at different polling stations. And what they were really interested in studying was like, what is the effect of observers on a whole host of, election day violence and other measures of rigging and
intimidation.
Fraud. Yeah, exactly. Intimidation is up there. And so that's one study that they've worked on, and that's out there, and it's really interesting. But for these purposes, what we also observed is that where there were election observers, biometric machines were 50% less likely to break down. So the placement of observers is dramatically influencing whether or not the technology is working. And these observers aren't people who have like a particularly good understanding of how to
background.
They're not like there to fix the machines, prevent them from overheating, make sure there's battery backups, right? So there's some other mechanism. And we unfortunately can't know exactly what it is, but we do know that it's only consistent with a story where there are people hoping through action that the machines break down, and then it can be taken advantage of in other ways. And a colleague of mine at UCLA, Manuel Gurke, he's done work in Colombia where he also observed election day practices during a municipal election there. And one thing, he observed election day rigging where buses of people were being moved around. And he also observed this, not a breakdown of the machines, but the security forces that were present were just allowing people into the polling station without having to go through the biometric verification check. It was just outright being bypassed. So in both of these cases, you're seeing technology having absolutely no effect because it's being allowed to break down. There isn't the support for these systems. There isn't backups for them. And so while it could be really useful at cleaning up double voting, it has all these other problems.
Right. And then as far as technology goes, again, there's the idea of electronic voting because it hasn't been implemented in Pakistan yet. But it's the idea that you eliminate a lot of these issues and you eliminate the hassle of voting as well. And I think there's a study that was done in Brazil, which showed how. I think we can talk more about that.
There's a rollout of a program. So, like we were talking about earlier, the different steps that have to be taken at the polling station, making sure the paper's folded the right way, put in the right box. It can lead to all kinds of problems. I mean, you see this in a very well publicized case in the United States in 2000 when George Bush defeated Al Gore. There were these problems with these hanging chads where the way that you voted was you were to push this lever down through your ballot card, and then only if the lever went all the way through and cleanly punched out the piece of paper would it be counted. It would be invalid otherwise. And there were a lot of ballots that had like the piece kind of dangling at the bottom of the ballot, didn't get fully separated from the paper, and they didn't count. And so there's a big controversy over like so many were disqualified, the margin of victory was so small. And so there's all these like technical parts of elections that can go wrong. And this isn't necessarily, fraudulent, although you could try to design it to be so difficult that maybe if you didn't want certain groups of the population, maybe less educated people or people who have just like trouble keeping their coloring in a circle. Like if you had to fill in a circle perfectly to vote, I wouldn't be able to vote at all. I'd be all over the place. So all of these things could be intentional, but mostly they just make elections harder to run. And so in this Brazilian case, in the 90s, they were introducing electronic voting. And so what they did was they didn't have enough machines at first. They didn't have the system set up that they could do it in the whole country at the same time. Brazil's a very large country. There's a lot of different municipalities, and so they wanted to roll it out in the large municipalities first. And so what this researcher, Thomas Fujiwara, did is he studied the places that were just small enough that they didn't get the electronic voting machines.
Okay.
But and compared those to those that were just big enough to get the machines. Right. So these places are comparable on a whole bunch of other characteristics.
Okay.
And he was able to use that as his comparison for what was the effect of electronic voting machines.
Yeah.
And he shows that the percentage of valid votes when you have electronic voting machines goes up from 78% to 89%.
Yeah.
So it's this huge increase in the enfranchisement of the population. And so this isn't about fraud, but it's about like the legitimacy of the election. If your election de facto disqualifies 10% of your population, then it can't really be called a fair election or an accessible election for sure. He also shows that this has consequences for the kinds of policies that are implemented later. He links this increase in enfranchisement to an increase in health spending and health outcomes, especially among those who are less educated in these areas. And trying to show that like these small technical things about election administration can have huge consequences for policy outcomes and all that kind of stuff.
And insofar as polling goes, because you see a lot of polling happens pre-elections, pre-election day at least, that this party is predicted with this many votes. How effective do you think that is in eliminating fraud and in eliminating the chances of rigging happening?
Right. I think in order for surveys, public opinion surveys, to kind of mitigate the amount of fraud, there has to be a clear understanding that the surveys are good enough that people could get caught. But I think more importantly, it kind of takes part of the stress off of the election commission itself, in the sense that we can have actors outside of the government, outside of those running the elections, who can be providing information and improving the transparency of the election process, where the public has more information. So in the run-up to this most recent election in Pakistan, there were, I think, 3 major polls that I saw at least that were put out there, one in June and then 2 others in July. There's a great write-up of one of them in the Herald magazine that Dawn puts out, the latest one. And so these 3 polls tried to get a representative sample, in some cases, I think more effectively than others. But basically, they provide a benchmark by which you can check the results of the election. Right? Yeah. So if you're worried that there was some massive rigging where, the PTI should have had like 10 percentage points fewer votes than they had, well, then you can kind of look at the polling and say, well, this is kind of in line with what we should have expected given what people were saying beforehand. And so if you look at the results from those 3, and especially the trends from those 3 over time, you see that in general the results are mostly in line with what you'd predict with the surveys. There is more of a bump for the PTI from those surveys to the results, and a decrease for the PPP and the PMLN. But those polls, it's not a huge gap, and those polls came out before the conviction of the Sharif. So it's still hard to know what's going on.
How effective
Right. But the solution there isn't to ignore polls or to think that they're not working well, but rather to have more of them, and to ensure that they're being run more often, making sure that the government isn't making it hard for people to do surveys. There's a lot of administrative hurdles here to getting surveys done for a lot of very good reasons, but it also makes it hard to do a lot of high quality surveys at affordable amounts. And so when you have a lot more high quality and a larger quantity of polls, your estimates just become more accurate. You become better at providing a benchmark for people. And this helps just kind of set expectations. The big pitfall, and this happens all over the place, and it's happened here before as well, is that people can use and abuse the numbers to say kind of what they want. People cherry pick the answers that make them look good. So that's a whole can of worms, but that's something that we can't really solve. In general, interested observers should be able to use high quality polling to just sanity check the results. Does this just make sense, or did something crazy happen here?
Okay. And to try to sum up our podcast, basically sticking true to our Pakistan 100 theme, where do you think technology is headed in terms of helping us conduct cleaner, fairer, better elections by 2047, let's say, when Pakistan turns 100?
Right.
Because insofar as what we've seen, that just happened with RTS, we're beginning to experiment with technology. And what are your recommendations, so to speak, for Pakistan to head into a nicer direction?
Right. I think the ECP knows better than anybody where their kind of pitfalls are. And I think that we've seen them trying to address those with things like the RTS. And there's also the results management system, which is where the ROs are supposed to enter the results so it's quickly entered. But I believe that also stopped working. But so I'm optimistic about the involvement of technology in the elections process. I think that there are two things that need to be addressed before I can just say things will be great in 2047.
Yeah.
3 things. I always do that. So the 2 major things is that the ECP needs to make sure that when they put in place some piece of technology, it needs to be piloted and thoroughly tested beforehand, like they tried with the biometric machines, right? They need to go through that whole process of learning because it's very, very difficult to, in a huge country like Pakistan, many different provinces, contexts, large population, to roll out a big project like this. The second thing that they need to do is make sure that when it fails, there's a backup. Technology always fails. Anybody who's used a phone, laptop, whatever, it breaks down.
Of course, yeah.
So when that happens, there needs to be a backup system in place. Now, for the RTS, there was one. It's the old school way of handing the papers up and then everything gets aggregated. But you want to make sure that that's what you want to have as your backup. It needs to be explicit that this is what we want to have as the backup. Then I think the third thing that's important, and that this I'm a little bit more pessimistic of, and I don't really have the expertise or the information to prognosticate about this. And I think anybody that does is probably blowing a lot of hot air. And that's the general atmosphere around elections, and that has to do largely with the freedom of the press and their ability to openly discuss what the ECP is trying, talk about in the pre-election period what is happening, who's being disqualified, why they're being disqualified, being able to do the investigative journalism that really informs the public about what's going on. And I think that there's no solution to all of these different pre-rigging problems. Some tech solutions can help with a lot of the election day solutions, but just making sure everybody has as much information as possible. And there's a very strong, in my experience, I've never been in a country or met a people who consume as much news as Pakistanis do. In my experience, my personal experience. And so making sure that news is high quality, and then everything else follows from that. There's nothing else that can really be done in those situations. So I'm optimistic in the sense that people want the news, right? And so the ECP is trying to implement new technology, and so I'm fairly optimistic. But you can never, predict kind of what the larger forces really are doing.
We need access to the right kind of news.
Right.
And we need the right kind of people to implement these technologies, basically. All right. Thank you so much, Luke, for this podcast today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.